Thank you so much for spending one of the last hours of the year with us. I want to introduce you to Nikolas Wolfe, who is the co-founder and now Chief Technology Officer of Eduling. And perhaps you have heard about it. It's a platform that now we have branded as the hub for task-based teaching and learning. And so
Okay.
thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, you're very welcome. You're very welcome.
Yeah,
It's a
thanks for
nice way
joining.
to end the year. I can't imagine anything I'd like to talk about more at the end of the year than task-based language teaching.
Yeah, so it's lucky for us then.
No hints of sarcasm at all.
And I would love to introduce Professor Rod Ellis, who is a world-renowned linguist and leading expert in second language acquisition, known for preaching SLA theory with practical language teaching, especially through his influential work on task-based language teaching, implicit explicit learning, and individual differences in language learning. He is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Auckland in New Zealand and Senior Professor at Anaheim University in the US, Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, and one of the top cited scientists in the field of applied linguistics. And for me, I had the honor of taking Dr. Ellis's courses during my doctoral studies and conducting my dissertation on task engagement under his supervision at Anaheim University. So again,
Uh,
thank you so much.
Not at all. Just one little thing to add. I am an emeritus professor in two universities. You mentioned the University of Auckland,
Yeah.
but actually my latest position is really emeritus professor at Curtin University in Perth, Australia.
Yes. Yes. So sorry for not mentioning it, but I know that Dr. Ellis was working at Curtin University also in Australia and many other universities. I remember also in China and Temple University
Yeah.
in the US. And actually, maybe I would love for Nick to talk a little bit about him. You and I have
Oh,
known each other for a long time, but maybe Nick, you can introduce yourself a little bit.
I'm uh, maybe a little starstruck here because I've seen papers and had your textbooks for a while. And when I realized that Lynn's PhD advisor was Rod Ellis, I was like, oh, really? That's a that's it's funny because you don't often get to put names with the faces. You just read these papers and there's just like names that often occur in them. Um, but anyway, I'm by training I am a um, computer scientist, but I focus on language technologies. And my background is mostly in speech recognition. I worked on language learning, um, like using speech-based technologies at Amazon and Google. And I've uh, kind of tried looking at this through the lens of big tech, and I find that there's not really people aren't really paying attention to the research in SLA. And when I met with Lynn last September and we had a conversation about Eduling, I thought that here's an opportunity to actually try something that isn't just sort of applying whatever people think technology should be in an app and gamifying it and then kind of expecting the rest to follow. They're actually taking sort of a research-oriented approach first and working backwards to find the technologies that would work for it. So that's kind of my background. So
Thank you very much for that introduction.
question for you is, do you know what your citation count on Google Scholar is, if you had to guess?
Oh, I'm vain enough to check every now and again, so I know.
Okay. For the record, it's 152,668, which is
Wow.
pretty good
Yeah.
in terms of influence. But yeah, just a silly question.
I would like to ask the second question here in the list that I
Okay.
sent to you. And what is task-based language teaching and how has it been applied worldwide from your research as well as your experience?
All approaches to language teaching have to address really two questions. And that is, how do you organize the content of your language teaching program, and secondly, how are you actually going to implement the program? So task-based language teaching has things to say about both the design of a syllabus, the content, and also the implementation. The essential thing about the design is that whereas most traditional language teaching takes as its starting point the various bits and pieces of language that you want to teach, and they constitute the content of the syllabus, in task-based language teaching, you simply identify tasks that you want the students to perform without trying to specify what particular language you are trying to teach through the performance of those tasks. And then regarding implementation, there are various ways of implementing tasks, but in general, a key feature is that there should be a primary focus on meaning as learners perform the task, and also that there should be opportunities taken to draw learners' attention to form. So task-based language teaching, like all approaches, addresses those two issues. First of all, how do you actually design the content of the course? And then secondly, how are you going to implement the tasks? Now, there are differences with regard to both of those aspects of task-based language teaching. For example, some people argue that in order to select tasks, you need to conduct a needs analysis in order to try to find out what tasks your students will need to perform in real life. That is the approach that Long and advocates of Long's TBLT approach have adopted. Others, including myself, have suggested that in many teaching situations, learners don't really have any particular target tasks that they will need to perform in English, in the target language. And therefore, you need some other principle to decide what task to select. And probably the principle that you need to draw on is students' interests. What particular topics would they be interested in performing tasks about? So there's that difference there. And then with regard to implementation, there are also differences. Some people, for example, argue that while tasks are being performed, teachers should not engage in any correction of students, but just simply let them perform them. Other advocates of task-based language teaching argue that corrective feedback serves as a very important way of focusing learners' attention on linguistic form, and therefore has a role while they are actually performing a task, while the primary focus remains on trying to communicate meaningfully. So you can see that task-based language teaching is not monolithic. That is to say, it is not just one thing. There are different versions of task-based language teaching, but central to all of them is the idea that you base your program and individual lessons on specific tasks. And then you have to think about how you're going to implement those tasks that will facilitate language acquisition.
Hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for that answer. And I'm so glad that you mentioned meaning and form. And to me, that is fundamental that students have to focus on meaning, but also their attention has to be drawn to form. So I just want to ask a follow-up question. You talk about the starting point of designing a program by using tasks, right? But what is the difference between the task-based approach and, say, the content-based approach or the project-based approach?
all of the project-based approach and the content-based approaches can be task-based, but don't have to be task-based. For example, in a project-based approach or even a content-based approach, your starting point might not necessarily be tasks. It could be the language that is associated with a particular content, or the language that is associated with the particular project that you want students to do. So content-based language teaching and project-based language teaching are likely to be task-based, but needn't be.
So it depends on how it is implemented in the classroom.
Usually content-based and project-based language teaching involve a mixture of task-based language teaching and probably more traditional type language teaching that is language-focused.
But if you're designing, I mean, most classroom-based setups, you have essentially like a syllabus or a curriculum, and at least in maybe the more traditional classroom-based, there's sort of certain types of grammatical structures and vocabulary that get added to it. And I know that that's sort of the explicit teaching approach. But if you're doing a purely task-based curriculum, would the individual like items in the curriculum essentially be tasks, or is there something?
The design of the content of the program centers around the selection of the tasks that you want students to perform.
How do you approach the needs for each task? Like if there's a task that requires a certain language or certain grammatical form, I guess, how do you seed that with simpler tasks?
Well, I mean, this takes us into a discussion about different types of tasks. And one important distinction about tasks is whether they are unfocused or focused. And an unfocused task is a task where you've decided to include that task with no particular idea about what language that task will create opportunities for learners to learn, right? That's an unfocused task. And by and large, task-based language teaching is primarily concerned with unfocused tasks. But another type of task is a focused task, which is where you select something that has all the properties of a task, but it's been designed in such a way that it might elicit, say, the use of a particular grammatical structure. So you might want to elicit the use of the simple past tense, or you might want to elicit hypothetical conditionals, in which case you would choose a task that provided opportunities for learners to produce those grammatical structures, to use those grammatical structures. It does not follow, of course, that when the students do the task, they will actually use the particular grammatical feature that you designed the task to provide an opportunities for them to use. It doesn't follow that they will. They may or they may not, right? Irrespective of whether a task is focused or unfocused, the task has to satisfy a definition of a task. And you don't have a question here about the definition of a task, but I think I probably need to say something about it. What is a task? And a task is a language teaching activity that meets 4 criteria. And the criteria that I have used are: 1, that the primary focus must be on meaning. In other words, when learners do the task, they should be really focusing on simply trying to communicate to achieve the outcome of the task. Secondly, in order to provide opportunities for communication, there has to be some kind of gap, because real communication always involves dealing with some kind of gap. And there are perhaps 2 principal gaps, possibly 3, but 2 main gaps. One is an information gap, where one person has information and the other doesn't. And the other is an opinion gap, where students will share opinions about a particular issue, etc. And the third criterion is that students are free to use their own linguistic resources. There's no attempt to direct them to use some particular, say, grammatical structure or some particular set of vocabulary items. And that is true whether the task is focused or unfocused, because even in a focused task, you do not tell the students what the focus of the task is. The idea is that the task itself will naturally elicit the use of the particular target features, right? So using own linguistic resources is the third criterion. And the fourth criterion is that the outcome must be a communicative outcome, not a linguistic outcome. In other words, you evaluate the task in terms of whether students have managed to, for example, tell a story if it's a narrative task, or to complete a map if it involves listening to information that you have to put on a map, etc. That there has to be some clear communicative outcome. You do not evaluate it in terms of whether students have used language correctly.
Do you know that there's an acronym for it? Recently, I read an article, and your criteria actually have an acronym, the McGoo, M for meaning, G for gap, O for own resources, and O for outcome. And I like that a lot because now it is a little bit easier to remember the four criteria.
It's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
Like the own resources.
People vary in how they like acronyms.
Yeah.
I think we have acronymic people and non-acronymic people. I am definitely a non-acronymic people.
Okay, so you're not impressed. But
they drive me crazy because, you know, I always have to go back and find out what they're referring to.
I want to ask a follow-up question, actually, because in that article also, they asked teacher to evaluate a reading comprehension activity. And I mean, using your four criteria, and most teachers would say that a reading comprehension activity by completing a multiple choice question or different multiple choice questions satisfies the four criteria of a task. Would you say that it is a task?
I don't think that there is a communicative outcome. I think if it's a multiple choice, the outcome is the choice, the option that you've selected in each multiple choice comprehension question. So the goal is simply to choose the correct answer in the multiple choice. So I don't see that there is a communicative outcome. Yes, there's a focus on meaning. There really is no gap. Right? There's no real gap there, because you're given the text, and you simply have to identify the meaning of the text. Where's the gap? Is there an information gap? Is there an opinion gap? No. And thirdly, they don't really have to use their own linguistic resources, do they? Well, they do to a degree, because they have to read the text and understand the text. So you could argue that that one is met, right? But it seems to me, and actually it raises what I think is another important thing, and that many language teaching activities may satisfy some of the criteria in my definition, but not all of them. And I don't think that a multiple choice activity really satisfies all of them. I don't think that, in particular, the outcome, it doesn't satisfy the outcome criterion.
Yeah, maybe they are not achieving a very specific, real like outcome in some way, reading for a real purpose, right? If there is a specific purpose in the reading, then perhaps it's more
task-based language teaching is purposeful, because basically the idea is to achieve the outcome of the task. So the outcome, or achieving the outcome, or trying to achieve the outcome, is your purpose for doing the task. And that outcome must be communicative. It could be telling a story. It could be filling in information on a map. I think when you have tasks that the outcome is clearly not linguistic, like filling in information on a map or filling information on a chart, the outcome is quite clearly communicative there. But I think you can also argue that if the outcome is linguistic, say telling a story or making an argument, then that is also quite clearly a communicative outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I see. Thank you so much. So we would like to ask a broader question in terms of second language acquisition. In our context, it's also in the context of technology development. So what do you think are the most important principles of second language acquisition for classroom instruction and technology development? Things that we absolutely have to incorporate or consider.
Well, that's kind of two questions. I'm not so sure I can answer the technology one. I'm too old to talk about modern technology in great depth. I pretend to be an expert. I'm not, right? General principles. I think that you have got to relate your principles to the two aspects of task-based language teaching that I've mentioned. One is the specification of content, and secondly, the actual way in which you implement individual tasks, right? The methodology of task-based language teaching. And therefore, we have to have principles that relate to those two. And that's what happens in a lot of written work on task-based language teaching. For example, with regard to task selection, one of the very key issues, irrespective of whether you're going to base the tasks on target tasks, like in long, or whether you're going to base them on students' interests, as in the TBLT that I've been more concerned with, you have to decide which tasks to do early on, which to do later, etc. There have to be, as always, in all types of tasks, all types of language teaching approaches, there has to be a process of grading and sequencing tasks. And one of the challenges, I think, in task-based language teaching is identifying the principles that will underlie the grading of tasks and sequencing of tasks. And I think that this is perhaps one area that task-based language teaching needs to actually give a lot more thought to. The usual principle that is applied for grading tasks is the notion of task complexity. The notion of complexity figures in the grading of all types of content for a language program, including grammatical structures. So in a traditional syllabus, one would try to teach what one considers to be easy structures first, then slightly more difficult, and so on. And the same in task-based language teaching, one would want to start with what one might consider to be easy tasks for beginner level learners, what would be more appropriate tasks for intermediate level learners, and for advanced learners. But I think the notion of task complexity is not very well worked out at the moment. There are various factors that probably do influence the complexity of tasks, such as the amount of information that needs to be processed, whether the task requires reasoning or doesn't require reasoning, whether the task requires talking or communicating about something you can see or about something that you can't see. These are factors that people have suggested can be used to identify task complexity. I'm not really terribly convinced with those. I think that probably in order to think more clearly about task complexity, we ought to think more about types of tasks rather than the individual design features of tasks. So, for example, it does seem to me that another important distinction about tasks is the difference between input-based and output-based tasks. And if you're dealing with beginner-level learners, then clearly you need to use input-based tasks, right? Tasks that do not require them to produce because they have not yet developed sufficient linguistic resources in order to produce. Therefore, the tasks have to be listening tasks or possibly reading tasks, etc. Another distinction that I think is important in terms of types of task is the distinction between information gap and opinion gap tasks. In general, information gap tasks can be thought of as easier for students to do than opinion gap tasks. It's much easier to just describe things than it is to develop arguments and reasoning for things. So my own feeling is that probably the whole issue about grading tasks is something that task-based language teaching needs to continue to look at. And I don't think it's going to be solved by looking at individual design features of tasks like plus minus reasoning, plus minus information units, etc.
You can tell me if I'm reaching here, but I'm wondering because Stephen Krashen talks a lot about the natural order hypothesis, and I know there's evidence for this, like the errors that people make seem to follow patterns if they're learning a particular language. Is there any overlap between an ideal kind of arrangement of tasks from simple to difficult and natural order, or is that picking grammatical forms too much?
I think the answer is no. And I'm not even certain that the notion of natural order is very useful anymore. I think if we're looking at how learners develop a second language, you need to take a much broader perspective. For example, when learners first start to learn a language, they tend to focus on comprehension, trying to comprehend input, right? Rather than trying to produce it, yeah? And then when they do start to produce, and of course the natural order is actually based on production, so it ignores everything that goes before people start to produce, right? But I think when learners start to produce, they tend to produce highly indexicalized sentences, truncated sentences, sentences that may lack a verb, etc., right? And may simply string together nouns and adjectives, etc. And then gradually they progress to a stage where they begin to introduce verbs. And when they begin to introduce verbs, yes, these are typically not marked for tense. And then gradually they learn how to mark the verbs for tense, etc. So I think you need to take a much broader brush idea about how learners learn, and the idea that there is a list of grammatical structures that are learned in a certain order, which in any case, many researchers now dispute. Yeah, they dispute it. I don't think it's a very helpful way to start thinking about task-based language teaching. I mean, the view of language learning that I think is much more useful is the one that is being advanced by Klein when he talks about the basic style, and then he elaborates how that basic style develops over time in language learners. And I feel that this is a much more useful way of thinking about how task-based language teaching can feed into second language learning.
I'm wondering if, because in these other examples like natural order and monitor theory and stuff, there's kind of this prior assumption that we believe in Chomsky's universal grammar. And I'm wondering, if does TBLT, what kind of assumptions about linguistic knowledge or how implicit knowledge is represented in the brain, what does it make any assumptions about that?
Well, I don't think task-based language teaching draws on universal grammar. And to be absolutely honest, I think that's one of its strengths. I don't think universal grammar has anything to offer language teachers whatsoever, right? And to be absolutely honest, the idea that there's some kind of universal grammar that dictates our ability and how we master a particular language is heavily disputed these days. My namesake, Nick Ellis, has argued that learning a language is actually very similar to learning any other particular skill. It involves a set of procedures by which one develops implicit knowledge, and also the role of consciousness that can play in the development of implicit knowledge, right? So the idea that, there's something special about learning a language is perhaps not true. I personally would not support it. I think universal grammar has definitely seen its heyday. If you look at books on second language acquisition, they probably still mention it, but it gets a pretty small mention.
The time of the Bayesians has arrived.
No. What I think is, the view that Klein's view about how people learn a language is obviously entirely compatible with the view that Nick Ellis has, that we have implicit learning procedures, and also we have the ability to consciously reflect on language, and we need to explain how language learning takes place in terms of the interface between these implicit learning processes and the explicit knowledge that we can get about language by reflecting on it.
There are certain, I guess, public figures who characterize, like Bill Van Patten will say things like, language is not what's in the textbook. It's something it's not a subject matter. It's something different than, say, learning history or math. And I'm wondering, because like what you said kind of cuts against that a little bit, but would you consider language, how much is it like other subjects, or how different is it? Why do we have to, does it deserve its own pedagogy?
Okay. Because I think other school subjects really rely on explicit learning. It's a very conscious process about acquiring knowledge and using knowledge to perform particular tasks, right? That's what learning history is about, or learning science is about, right? You have to learn the facts of science, and you have to perhaps also consciously understand the principles that underlie facts. Yeah. But where language learning is concerned, there's always the possibility of learning them implicitly. And even when even older people, still have some ability to learn implicitly. I would argue that implicit learning is much more important in our life than explicit learning. Most of the things that govern how we live our lives on a day-to-day basis have involved implicit learning, right? You don't learn to drive a car through explicit learning. You don't learn how to ride a bicycle. You don't learn how to tie a shoe through explicit learning, right? All of these things are picked up by observing and perhaps being given some kind of help and guidance in performing them, right? So it seems to me that, and this is, I think, one of the problems with putting foreign languages into the school curriculum, that ideally they require you to reorientate your thinking about how learning takes place in a classroom. And it's not going to be primarily by explicit learning. It's going to, it needs to be with a language, primarily implicit learning. If you don't engage in these implicit learning processes, you'll never really develop any meaningful communicative ability in a language. You might be able to do tests, right, and get high scores on tests, but you will not be able to communicate. I mean, this is what goes wrong and has gone wrong in many Asian countries for a long time, although it's changing now a lot. And that is that by and large, languages are being taught in much the same way as maths, science, history, etc., right? As a set of facts and maybe the principles that underlie the facts. And there has been very little opportunity for implicit learning. So you have situations in China, Japan, Vietnam, etc., where students may have gone through 6 years of learning a language in school, and then you meet them, and you can't even really have the simplest conversation with them. They simply have no implicit knowledge of the language. And without that implicit knowledge, you are communicatively incompetent.
That definitely matches with my public school education in Spanish.
And my own.
Yeah.
And my own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I learned French and German very badly at school, following traditional approach, what are the rules of French, what are the rules of grammar, memorizing vocabulary, etc. And very little opportunity to ever use that knowledge in a sort of communicative type way, right? My Spanish is a bit better, still very limited. No puedo hablar español bueno.
Well, I got that one.
I got that too.
No puedo.
Mm.
But I can actually communicate a bit in Spanish, right? And the reason was I learned it in cafes and streets in Spain in the 1960s,
Yeah.
right? And it stuck with me in a way that French and German has not really stuck with me.
I'm just going back to the question I asked. That's why we are passionate about task-based language teaching, because of the potential of teaching students the ability to use the language and to communicate in the language. And my take is that you mentioned about the challenge in grading tasks, but you also say that it's a strength in some way, and I can feel it in the same way that if we provide students with rich and comprehensible input, right? Input in various situations through various tasks. And also if we have a lot of different types of tasks so that students can encounter language in many different situations for different purposes, then perhaps the acquisition takes care of itself in some way. So usually those are the two things that I feel like I want to pursue: diversity of input, diversity of tasks. And even when you give a task to students, like a very simple one, spot the difference, the very basic students can complete it with their very basic language. But a more advanced learner or speaker like myself maybe can be more elaborate in the language. So I actually like that openness of tasks in that way as well. But I do understand the need to also push learners forward by maybe pushing them to take risks with the language to produce more complex language, right? That's where learning happens. We want them to use language differently or in a more complex manner. And perhaps that's why task complexity is important in that aspect. Do you feel like I understand it correctly in terms of the need for a task complexity model?
Except if you go back and listen to what you've just said, your starting point is tasks mean learner production, and they need it.
I also mentioned comprehensible inputs. So that is
Yeah.
the input aspect that I think is very important as well. And I fully
Yeah.
believe in input-based tasks, the
But
necessity.
if students are beginners, then you can't have any productive. Your tasks have to all be input-based tasks, right? And if you have complete beginners, you probably have to carry on with input-based tasks for weeks, right? Before you start putting them in a position of having to try to actually produce a language. I mean, we know that basically in any type of language learning, first, second, third, foreign, second, that basically comprehension precedes production. So that is a very important principle in task-based language teaching, in thinking about how to design a program in task-based language teaching. But you're right, certain types of production tasks can actually work well with learners of very different levels of proficiency in the target language. That some students can do a task using very simple language, others can do the same task using more complex language. In fact, there's a really interesting paper by someone called Lenzing, a German researcher, and she used a very, very simple production-based task, which she called the Martian task. And the Martian task had students working in pairs, and one student had to pretend they came from Mars, and the other student had to pretend that they are an Earthling, they belong to the Earth, and they had to simply find out as much as they could about the life of the other people, of their partner, etc. So the Martian had to find out about the Earthling's life, and the Earthling had to find out about the Martian's life. And she did this same task with learners at a pretty low level of proficiency, probably kind of maybe A1 moving into A2, right? And she also did it with students who were very much more C1, etc. Yeah, in terms of the European way of classifying students' proficiency. And she was able to document that you got very different types of language from the same task. Yeah. So perhaps one way of solving the complexity problem is, as I said, to focus much more on types of task. Start with input before you start to use output-based tasks. And when you start to use output-based tasks, try to use tasks that give students the freedom to be able to use whatever language they have in order to do it, right? And not worry too much. I mean, the Martian task, the notion of task complexity seems redundant, because basically how complex it was depended not on the task, but on the learner, the student.
We want to ask the next question because we have, I think, a lot more also. And I guess that you have addressed this, but I think I want to ask it anyway. Is TBLT alone sufficient for language acquisition? And this is just me and Nick thinking about whether students also have to listen a lot and read a lot. I mean, even without performing a task, right? That's what learners do. And for example, maybe Steve Krashen would say that the most useful thing that you can do is self-selected reading for pleasure. So I just want to ask that question. Do you think that TBLT alone is sufficient?
I think reading for pleasure is the task.
Okay.
The task.
Although
right?
You don't have to really achieve any non-linguistic outcome.
There is your non-linguistic outcome is that you understood what you've read, right? And maybe enjoyment. You enjoyed what you read. There's still a non-linguistic outcome, right? There's still an outcome. And outcomes, in any case, needn't all be non-linguistic. Sometimes they can be linguistic, right?
but not
And
the reading comprehension.
yeah, I mean, probably Krashen would not want to have a task linked to reading that involved production. Would he be interested in a task that perhaps involved non-production, such as reading something and drawing a picture about what you've read, right? My guess is that probably Krashen wouldn't mind that. What Krashen would want, would probably be against, is the idea of trying to add a production element to pleasure reading, right? But he might be interested in some types of tasks that have a very clear outcome, such as drawing a picture or filling in a map, yeah, or etc.
Yeah.
So your examples of things that weren't tasks, to my mind, they are tasks. They are tasks. I mean, if you're reading something, you can argue the focus is on meaning. There's an information gap because you don't know what's in the text until you read it, etc. Right? You're using your own linguistic resources in order to be able to understand, and there is probably some kind of outcome in terms of did you enjoy what you read, right? Or do you have a clear picture of what happened in the story?
Right. So there has to be a real purpose there, right? And that gives learners the reason to engage in language use and language learning, or those activities anyway. There's some kind of, they care about it. So I'm just feeling that there's the motivational aspect of it.
Krashen talks about the pleasure principle.
Yeah.
That is the essential principle, that you are interested and enjoy what you read. So the outcome is the pleasure or the enjoyment that you get from reading something. It's still a task. Silent reading is still a task.
But how does this, like these types of kind of first start initial tasks, even if they're input oriented, I mean, maybe you don't read for pleasure as a initial task if you're first learning something, but when the L2 has a different script than the one you're used to, or in the other case, I mean, I was thinking about this from, so I lived in Ghana for 3 years. I was a teacher in the Peace Corps, and that's kind of what got me into language technologies in general, because I mean, I already had a computer science background, and the number of languages and the possibilities for like building tools for them, like speech recognizers or translations and things like that. But there's a lot of languages, particularly in, I mean, in Ghana, but also like West Africa, a lot of places in Africa where people go in and out of them learning, I mean, basically like learning them to fluency without ever encountering the written script. And some of them don't really have a standardized orthography. Like apart from something that may have been written down by, you know, missionaries or a colonial authority or something, there's no standard orthography, or there's not, or even if there is one, there's one that people regularly use. So if we're in either of those situations where the script is unfamiliar or scripts aren't really used in practical day-to-day use, how do you approach the early tasks or pleasure reading in those situations?
Well, first of all, you worked in Ghana. You started off your professional life as a Peace Corps in Ghana. I started off my professional life as a language teacher in a very, very bush school in Zambia. way back in 1967. And I worked there for 3.5 years in this very remote bush school. You're right. You know, Africans are generally amazingly successful linguists, in the sense that they often know more than one language. Zambia is a bit like Ghana. There are multiple languages, right? And there's probably one that they've sort of grown up with, but they've probably been exposed to many others as well. And they are able to move from one language to another, right? Quite easily. Well, one thing is absolutely certain, and that this ability that they have did not take place through explicit instruction and explicit learning. It took place through the natural process of implicit learning, through exposure to the language, mainly oral exposure, right? And also the ability to interact with people speaking the language. So interaction plays a very important role. So I think that your example of people in Ghana, the reason why they have that kind of linguistic ability, Zambia too, is because they have this natural capacity for implicit language learning. And that's what they've engaged in, right? That doesn't completely answer what you said. There was another part to it, but I forgot. What was it?
Well, I was thinking in like the design of a task-based program of instruction. If you were trying to teach or learn a language that has either an unfamiliar script or is primarily oral, like in practical use, most people simply don't write it.
Then you just have to teach it orally, I guess.
Well, I mean, we're really talking about two things that I think need to be kept separate here, which is developing, if you like, communicative competence in a language, primarily orally, as opposed to developing literacy skills, including being able to identify particular writing symbols, etc. Right? And I think that the teaching of writing and the learning of writing is quite different from the development of basic, linguistic communicative competence, right? I think it has to involve a very high level of consciousness, right? Most ways of teaching writing involve very deliberately exposing learners to symbols and their oral representation, etc. So I think that we really need to distinguish the development of a sort of basic linguistic communicative competence and the development of literacy skills, which would include the learning of new writing systems, such as Chinese or Japanese, etc., or Korean. And obviously, if you are a language teacher teaching those languages, it is quite important to address those, right? I probably wouldn't start off by teaching the writing systems from the word go. I would want to, as you suggested a moment ago, Lynn, focus on oral input and getting them to process oral input and moving gradually to trying to say a few things in the language, etc. Right? But somewhere along the line, you've got to actually probably fairly explicitly teach them the writing system.
Yeah.
Of course, the process of mastering a writing system is not entirely explicit.
Right.
But I think it is much more explicit, particularly in the initial stages, than developing oral competence.
Yeah. Wow, this is actually an interesting realization, because sometimes I have been talking about task-based language teaching so much, but then I also teach reading and writing, and I tend to be much more explicit in teaching those skills. But then it makes me realize that, yes, because learning those skills requires perhaps more explicit knowledge.
Well, Yeah, I mean, that explicit knowledge does not exist in a vacuum. There has to be also opportunities for implicit learning. I mean, how do people learn to spell? They're not taught the spelling of each individual word. They don't have to consciously, explicitly learn the spelling of each individual word. They pick up spelling, as Prashan has pointed out, largely by reading, right? And the implicit processes of matching the shape of a word to the meaning of the word kicks in, and it's a sort of implicit process.
Yeah.
So implicit processes are always there, but I think with something like writing, there has to be some explicit instruction as well.
Yeah.
In fact, even with oral development, even if one's thinking about task-based language teaching, and one's thinking, I mean, one of the misunderstandings about task-based language teaching is it's always associated with oral communicative competence. It's always associated with interaction. It's always associated with speaking, right? But it's not, of course, right? You can have tasks that are completely writing tasks, or completely listening or reading tasks, etc. Right? So task-based language teaching it is completely wrong to see that speaking and oral interaction is absolutely fundamental to task-based language teaching. It's important, but it's not fundamental. What's fundamental is that you have tasks that meet the criterion that I've said, and these are implemented in ways that are going to facilitate the process of language learning.
Yeah.
And sometimes in writing, to facilitate the process of language learning, you need some explicit help. I mean, one of the things that goes on in technology, and there's been quite a lot of research, is looking at the role of glossing in reading texts. Yeah. Now, a gloss is an attempt to make explicit the meaning of a particular word. So one can read, you can ignore the glosses and just read on. And you're engaging in a very implicit process, right? Or you can stop and look at a gloss, and that gives you some explicit understanding of a particular word, right? I mean, Long would say that glossing is a type of focus on form, attracting learners' attention to linguistic form while they are primarily focused on meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is exactly what we are doing with the Eduling platform as well. When the students read a text, we also let them tap on some language, perhaps to check the meaning of a word, or maybe just a quick explanation of a phrase or a sentence. So in my mind, it's also incidental focus on form, but sometimes you never know what students pay attention to. Maybe perhaps mostly they're gonna just tap on everything to try to memorize words. So it's interesting, but that's something we are experimenting with in terms of focus on form in the context of a bigger focus on meaning. But talking about technologies, we would really love to ask you about some of your take on technology, yeah, if you don't mind. So here, maybe I will ask a few questions together, and if you would like to answer any of them or a combination. So we have here the question about AI technologies, and perhaps I don't know if you have used ChatGPT or if you have seen students use it to practice speaking or just to text with it. So the question here is, what do you think about the application of AI technologies in language learning? And the next one is, what do you think about the potential of AI in performing tasks with language learners? This is something that Nick and I have been focusing on. We want the AI agent to be able to perform a task with the learner. A very simple example is that it has a secret animal, and then the learners have to ask questions to find out what the secret animal is. So that is one task that we have been trying ourselves, or we have to describe a secret city and the AI has to ask questions and then guess what it is. And my next question here, how important is having opportunities to engage in naturalistic dialogue in language learning? And what are the features of the way human beings communicate that you think chatbots or AI systems that you've interacted with are noticeably missing?
As I've said, I am not an expert in technology in general and AI, but I have used it. I've used it a bit in research, and I'm thinking a little bit more about, how you can use it in teaching. So I think the starting point about thinking about the role of AI in task-based language teaching is to once again take the distinction that I made, which is true of all approaches, between content selection, syllabus design on the one hand, and the implementation of a particular language learning activity, language teaching activity. And I think that the way to think about AI is to think about how can I use AI in terms of task selection, task grading, what role is it going to play in developing the content of my task-based language program? And then secondly, how can we use AI to actually help the process of implementing a particular task? So I really think it really useful to make that distinction and talk about AI in both. I'm much more comfortable with the idea of using AI in terms of task design and task selection. I think it's an amazing tool. We know that from early studies in task-based language teaching that one of the problems that teachers often face is that their textbooks don't have enough tasks or don't have enough interesting tasks. And therefore, one of the problems is how can they do task-based language teaching when they don't have the actual material resources, the tasks? And obviously, AI can solve that. And I think that what's involved here is thinking about how AI can be used to design different types of tasks. How can what prompt do we need to give to an AI system in order to come up with an input-based task that would be suitable for, say, beginners or intermediate level learners, right? The design of the prompt is an absolutely crucial factor in the use of AI, right? The same with focus tasks. If we want to design a task that would provide opportunities for learners to use hypothetical conditional, what prompt do we give it? And remember, the prompt that we give it must tell the AI system that they have to develop a task, not an explicit exercise, right? So the AI system has to know what a task is, yeah, and does. But if you just put task, it probably won't do it because the word task tends to be used ubiquitously for any type of language learning activity, including multiple choice and exercises. So it needs to know what you mean by task. So I think, and that's what I think I'm probably more interested in, is how do we use AI to design tasks suitable for learners of different stages of development, etc. With regard to implementation, which is actually all your questions really related to it. One, my experience of bots when I go into systems where I go online and you can get online assistance, right? And you're communicating with a bot, is that it is painful.
It's like pulling teeth, right?
It's painful and very frustrating, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I again, with regard to the use of a bot, I think one probably got to think about how you use it in two ways. One might be, can we program a bot to interact with you in order to perform a particular task? Can we tell the bot how it needs to interact with you, right? And that, I think, is what a lot of stuff does. It tries to program the bot to respond to what you're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And recently, I started to get involved in a new AI developed language program in China. I've now opted out because I found it so frustrating, actually. And it was where you could arrive at an airport, and then they devised a task where you could go to the information desk and you could ask about say hotels, right? And I started to use that, and it just didn't tell me what I wanted to know, right? For example, what I really wanted to know was, what is the hotel that is close to the airport and gives me free shuttle service to it, right? And it couldn't cope with that. It couldn't do it, right? Because it hadn't been programmed to deal with that particular question about how far. It was programmed about, can you suggest a hotel? Yeah, etc. So I'm very, very dubious about the use of AI to program learners' performance of target tasks, like how to find a hotel near the airport that gives you free shuttle, right? Yeah. I'm very dubious about that, because I think there are potentially so many different questions you could ask about the hotel, and the bot is not going to be able to, it's only going to be able to cope with the ones that it's been programmed to cope with. Correct?
Yeah,
So,
I mean, well, I was gonna add
what happens if you're interacting with a bot? What happens if you're interacting with a bot in a much more open task, where the bot has not been programmed? The only thing that the bot knows is the task materials, the task work plan. You tell them what the task work plan is. You specify what it is they have to do, right? If it's an information gap, you provide the bot with the information that it will have, right?
Yeah, that's what we
when
do.
It interacts with a person who's got different information, etc. Right?
Yeah.
Now,
if
I
it's
don't know.
yeah.
I don't know what it's like when it does that. I don't know. You tell me. Can it do that?
We are still fine-tuning it to make it as engaging to learners as possible, but we think that it's an opportunity for learners to practice speaking, because again, students in many different countries don't have these opportunities, and maybe they have the experience with the chatbots that you have had the experience with. It's kind of very open-ended. It is kind of boring. It keeps saying the same thing. We know some of the limitations of those chatbots, but if you give it some information or if you create an information gap task and you give it some information and you tell it that maybe it doesn't know the information that the learner has, and then the learner has to solve that problem or complete a task with the chatbot, I personally find it much more engaging than any open-ended conversation that you can have with a generic chatbot out there. And in terms of implementation, and Nick knows more, that we are fine-tuning it so that, say, it can give a recast, or it can negotiate meaning, or maybe at some point it can give explicit correction or some kind of meta-linguistic explanation. And later on, if you want to try it, we don't have it exactly out yet, but if you want to try it, that's what we are trying to do.
I think that is much more useful. I mean, there's a lot of literature on the dangers of AI.
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're able to develop bots that can interact and negotiate meaning as effectively as a competent speaker of the language, right? Then you don't need the competent speaker of the language anymore. You don't need the teacher. AI replaces the teacher. And this is what people are saying. A lot of people are saying AI is going to change the world because it's going to make a lot of the things that people now do to earn money and live their lives, their work, redundant. They don't need to do it anymore. They can hire AI to do it, right? So, I mean, that concerns me. That really concerns me. And obviously, I suppose ultimately you can develop an AI system that will interact in the way that you've just described, Lynn, just as effectively as a competent speaker would. Yeah. I mean, the AI becomes the competent speaker. Do I look forward to a world where that happens? No, definitely not.
But my feeling is that students,
But
we
I won't
still
be
want to talk
around.
to people.
Eh?
We still think that students still want to talk to people. And the reason why they are learning a language is that they want to talk with speakers of that language. So it's kind of just, it just gives them the opportunities to learn the language, and then they will seek more opportunities to listen to authentic materials, YouTube videos out there, try to interact with speakers of that language, because to me, that's still more interesting. Or maybe you have a take on that to see if at one point students may just want to talk with the AI instead of real human beings.
Well, I mean, another difficulty with AI is that it removes the need to learn a language at all. I mean,
You mean like for translation or?
Yeah, with instant cell phone translation, right? Just say what you want and it comes out in English. I've had very successful communication with people in China where they do that all the time. I'm not doing it, but I say something and they record it and they work out what it is in Chinese and then they say a reply in Chinese and it comes to me in English.
Mm.
It's a bit of a tedious process, but most people don't need to engage in very rich interaction and rich communication in a foreign language. They probably need only a foreign language in a quite limited way. Most people.
I
And
mean, I'd hope people still want to learn.
AI will do it for you. So why bother trying to learn the language communicatively when you have a tool that can help you do the communication?
Mm.
I mean, I think that I mean, it completely removes the need for any sort of implicit learning because it's a very explicit process. Say something translated, and then
Yeah.
So I mean, I really do fear what AI is doing, both in terms of producing bots that can communicate effectively with you doing an information gap task. I think it might be much more difficult to get a bot to really do a an opinion gap task so effectively, because an opinion gap task is much more open. An information gap task is normally quite closed, but a task that involves developing argumentative positions, right, is much more open. And I wonder to what extent you can develop bots that will effectively do that.
Yeah, people
Well,
try to
that
debate with it,
yeah.
and it seems like it's capable. Maybe its ideas are still somewhat banal and not as interesting as hearing from someone with real experience, expressing their own ideas and telling their own stories. To me, it's still kind of boring to
Well,
debate with the bots, but
let me ask you another question about bots. All right. Do bots have a sense of humor?
No.
Well, sad.
yeah, so it cannot replace us then.
Yeah. I mean, but
Sad.
that is the I mean, part like part of what we're interested in is, I mean, the fear you express, I think that's definitely well taken. And that is like one potential outcome of the the current generation of these technologies, but the practical use of what's there now, um, even for something like voice translation, like the example you gave of if you say something and it translates into the language of the person you're speaking to, but the the sort of kind of public relations of these technologies versus the actual day-to-day, like on the ground experience of using them are there's a wide gap between there. And I mean, we've been thinking a bit about the how we can get it to, for instance, do something like a closed form task. So if there's a known answer, but you still have to like weave and talk through the series of steps to get to that, and that outcome is like
Yeah,
the
that's where I think bots will
yeah
work best. They will work
yeah
best with closed tasks,
yeah. I mean, the open
less well
form,
with open tasks.
and
But
that's
let me
that's
go back
been
to the humor thing.
Mm.
What would be one of the characteristics of a person you would consider to be a good teacher? A sense of humor.
Mm. Mm.
yeah.
Someone who can make you laugh, who can joke, right? And if bots can't do that, then it's going to be a shadow of what a real teacher should be.
Mm. And which is fine. We That's why we are thinking of I mean, creating engaging opportunities for students to talk with the chatbot to solve these kind of information gap tasks. But then it cannot replace teachers in the sense that when you talk with teachers, you
But it
talk with
will.
a real person with
It
real.
will.
Yeah.
What drives the world? What drives the world is money, right? And I'm sad to say, what drives the world is money. Yeah, particularly in the United States these days. And if people can get bots to do tasks very effectively, then why hire teachers?
Mm. Mm.
Just buy a program with lots of closed tasks where they can interact, etc.
Well, I would say one maybe ray of hope there is because we mentioned two different kind of modalities. There's the actual implementation of a task, and then the design or production of the materials for one.
That
And
the design and production materials, I'm a big supporter of AI.
but the I mean, the experience that I've had with them is that that's maybe ironically the thing that they're worst at in terms
No,
of because
they're
well,
very good.
if you ask it to produce a task and you have like I mean, you could imagine there's a prompt out there that has the four criteria for a task and maybe some other parameters like open form, closed form, what type of information gap. You could supply all of that and then ask it to produce something, but it's going to give you 5 tasks and then it's just going to start regurgitating different versions of them. And we we find that at least like the creativity that goes into some of the expert curated or created content, like I mean, like just spot the difference, right? If you were if that task exists already, your AI system might be able to regurgitate it just from the training data because it's basically been built to memorize more or less the entire internet, right? So if that exists already, then it can likely produce that or something adjacent to it. But new tasks that are fun and interesting or funny, even like maybe the premise is funny, you don't find a lot of that creativity from things that are AI generated?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think we should finish now.
Mhm.
It's been very interesting. I'll send you something that I asked DeepSeek to
Yeah.
do. I use DeepSeek. It's free and it does most of the things I want it to do,
Mhm.
right, for research purposes, etc.
Yeah.
And so I'll send you it. And what I'm going to send you will include the prompt that I put in, so you can see the prompt.
Mhm.
And I think it's come up with quite an interesting, well done task, right? It's an opinion gap task. And I plan to be experimenting with trying to get it to produce interesting input-based tasks, right? The other thing is that you're right about creativity. It will tend to, once it's got a particular pattern, it will tend to follow it, right? Although you can find ways of breaking the pattern by the prompt that you put in, right? By telling it not to do something and do something a bit different, right? You can do that. So yeah, I mean, I think I'll tell you something I heard recently, right? I was talking to someone and we were talking about publishing and publishing of EFL, ESL course books. And this person was telling me that they've heard that one publisher is no longer signing contracts with experienced teachers to write EFL course books. That what they do is hire one teacher. They hire one teacher to simply review materials that were developed by EI. So the whole course book is now developed by EI. And the only person they're hiring is one expert who will look at it in order to suggest fine tuning of it, etc. That's the future of EFL course books. Nightmarish. Nightmarish. Happening. It's happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a good take. This is from a comedian. I think he was on the Daily Show, but they were talking about AI taking jobs away, right? And I mean, particularly in the field of language technologies, like if you're a translator or a transcriber, or if you formerly had a job writing part of speech tags. I'm not sure if that was actually a job before NLP, but basically the idea was uh, the framing of the statement, like AI is taking jobs, is a little bit backwards, because what's really happening is somebody gave your job to AI, right? And there's a lot of this which is essentially choices that are being made by people who have the power to choose to move resources around, in terms of like, I'd rather hire one person to edit the output of AI as opposed to a number of people that are going to come together and edit content or write new content for a textbook. And those cost-cutting measures, I mean, the end result in a lot of cases is vastly reduced quality. And, maybe the powers that be don't place that high of a market value on those kind of things. But in general, that is kind of the trend. And I mean, I don't know. It does make me think about it, in the sense that we're essentially trying to build something that would do what a trained instructor would do. And I suppose if it was good enough, the argument could be made that it does essentially replace the teacher. But there's, I don't know, the model doesn't necessarily have to be that you get rid of teachers, because it seems like, at least in our experience, the curation of the content and the involvement of humans in the loop to actually, test and grade and fine tune the outputs of these things is a lot better of an experience than just letting the AI do it, which is the case for, there's quite a few apps already that are just like putting it in AI's hands and letting that be the driver of the entire thing. So Yeah, it's it's a little bit bleak. It's kind of ironic to talk about these things
I think it's going to
being in a company
completely
that's
alter
doing
our
it.
world. I mean, the thing that altered our world was obviously the World Wide Web. And, this is still part of AI as well. The AI couldn't function without the World Wide Web.
Yeah.
So, that was the first big change, but that, brought huge advantages like email so that you can communicate with people very quickly on email, but also disadvantages. For example, in 1967 to 1970, when I was in Zambia, I used to write very long letters to my parents in England and used to receive letters back from them. And that was very important. I've still kept those letters, by the way, the letters I got back. I still have them and I read them sometimes. They remind me of my father. My father wrote them. So they remind me, right?
Yeah.
Did you do that in Ghana?
With email.
Long ones?
But yeah, I mean, I had a few. Well, I actually had a blog that I tried to write at one point, and I wrote some fairly longish entries in that.
Would you say you're typical? I mean, what I'm getting at is that probably most people would communicate with their parents by email, but, one paragraph things, not kind of
Yeah,
500 words.
Yeah, I don't
yeah. I
remember
mean,
writing letters.
Oh, there you are. There you
I
are.
might be atypical in
There you
that
are.
case because I do write emails that are too long. You can probably tell from this conversation that I'm too wordy, but a lot of, yeah, I mean, you're in terms of the trend of what did people in general do. Yeah, a lot of it. I mean, I had Facebook. I mean, I taught ICT skills, so I actually had a computer lab connected to the internet in Ghana, which carried a whole different set of circumstances around like, yeah, teaching and access to the internet and what it was like being like in Ghana but connected to the internet at the same time. Um,
Well, I think you were
but
quite unique in that respect. Most people
writing long
probably
emails.
couldn't do it.
Yeah, it's
I mean, you see, something else that I think has happened as a result, certainly of technology, and that is the long turn has gone. The long turn is when you produce you produce speech that consists of a number of different sentences strung together, etc., as opposed to communication that consists of a single sentence or maybe two, right? Obviously, X is destroying the idea of the long term, right?
Or texting in
And
particular.
like short turns are very, very dangerous because you can, you don't develop a position. You just sort of put your position there.
Yeah.
So, I see the world as losing the long term.
Mm.
And I see the new generations I see growing up no longer really capable of producing long terms. Many people are not really capable of producing long pieces of writing
Mm.
or incapable of producing um, spoken language where they are putting together a coherent set of thoughts.
Mm.
Right? I see it disappearing.
The writing part is in danger for sure. Now that you can just input some ideas into AI and let it form a paragraph for you.
Well, long
well,
terms. I mean, one thing you might want to look at the use of AI is to what extent are you providing opportunities for learners to produce long terms?
Mm.
Because my guess is that bots tend to focus on fairly short terms.
Mm. We still have a kind of activity where learners record a 2-minute speech, for example. So
Okay,
I like it very much. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah, they have to tell a story and there has to be the beginning and the
I
end.
think that's important. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's an important aspect of language learning that you are not simply engaging in interaction with very short terms,
Right.
but you can actually produce a long term
Yeah.
orally as well as in writing.
Yeah.
So I think that there are these things that we need to think about. To my mind, I much prefer the idea of using AI by individual teachers to help them develop tasks that they can use for their particular students. And therefore, what we need is to train teachers to produce prompts that will enable them to get good stuff from AI.
Yeah, but for them to do it well, they need to know about task-based language teaching. They need to know what a task is. Yeah, and they need to be able to edit the materials, because I do see the advantage that teachers have in terms of knowing their students, knowing the context. So if they are able to edit, then the materials are much more interesting than what you and I can write from a distance and then give the materials to them. And that's my experience as well. Very specific details that are really related to their students' experiences.
AI is with us, and therefore we've got to work out, what ways we can use it. But, there is a hell of a lot written about AI that is looking at the dangers, and the dangers is what I've been talking about a moment ago, right? And I don't know how you deal with that. Maybe we should do what I think Finland did, which is everybody gets a minimum amount of money, a certain amount of money paid to them, right? That the government simply gives them a certain amount of money, enough money to basically survive in the culture, right? Not enough money to, own beautiful things and have a great lifestyle, etc., but enough money. And the idea is that instead of having welfare, we just give everybody a basic sum, which enables them to live. Now, of course, people who want to have a better life or more interesting life will go and get jobs and do things. But people who don't just have the basic amount, and that's it. And there's no welfare payments because everybody gets that basic thing.
And
I think this is really clever. Is it saying the basic needs exist for everybody, so we'll provide them, and then it's up to the individual as to whether they want to do and add something to that.
Right.
I really like the idea.
Yeah.
I haven't read too much about how successful it's been, but I think it's a fascinating idea. All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. It's been very interesting, very entertaining. And, next time I'll listen more and learn more and speak less.
Thank you so much for your time, and Happy New Year in a few days.
Yeah, Happy New Year.